I thought my husband Mike was the biggest coward in Cedar Falls, Iowa. When I told him I was pregnant after 3 years of trying, he vanished the very next morning like smoke in the wind. 4 years I spent raising our daughter Sophie alone, dealing with the whispers and sideways glances from neighbors who knew my story. 4 years of telling myself that some men just aren't built for fatherhood. But when I finally worked up the courage to clean out his locked workshop behind our house, the antique appraiser took one look at what was hidden inside and immediately called the police. What they found didn't just change everything I thought I knew about my husband's disappearance. It revealed a truth so shocking that it made every painful moment of the last 4 years suddenly make perfect sense in the most heartbreaking way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Miller, and if you had told me 5 years ago that I'd become a single mother in a small Iowa town, fighting to make ends meet while everyone whispered about my deadbeat husband, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I had what everyone in Cedar Falls considered the perfect marriage. Mike and I were that couple people pointed to as relationship goals. We'd met in college when I was studying accounting, and he was getting his degree in construction management. He was this gentle giant with calloused hands who could fix anything and had the kindest green eyes I'd ever seen. We got married when I was 23 and he was 26 in a small ceremony at the Cedar Falls Community Church, with our families and half the town in attendance. Mike worked for Henderson Building Company, the biggest construction outfit in our area, and I did bookkeeping for several local businesses from our little home office. We bought a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, with a white picket fence that Mike painted every spring, and a garage he converted into his workshop where he spent weekends building furniture and fixing neighbors' broken chairs and tables. Those first 2 years of marriage felt like a fairy tale. Mike would come home covered in sawdust and concrete dust, but he'd always clean up and help me make dinner. We'd sit on our back porch in the evenings, planning our future and talking about the family we wanted to build. Mike had grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, so the idea of creating our own family meant everything to him. He used to trace patterns on my palm and tell me about the treehouse he'd build for our kids, the way he'd teach them to use tools safely, how he'd never miss a single soccer game or school play. When we decided to start trying for a baby after our second anniversary, we were both so excited and confident. We were young, healthy, madly in love, and financially stable. We figured it would happen right away, like it seemed to for everyone else we knew. Month after month, we'd wait hopefully for those 2 pink lines that never came. After a year, we started seeing doctors and specialists. The fertility journey became this roller coaster of hope and crushing disappointment that tested our marriage in ways we'd never expected. I went through 2 miscarriages that left me devastated and questioning everything about my body and my worth as a future mother. Mike held me through every crying session, drove me to every appointment, and never once made me feel like it was my fault or that he was losing patience with the process. He'd rub my back when the hormone treatments made me sick and bring me tea when I was too sad to get out of bed. During our darkest moments, when I was convinced we'd never have children, Mike would take my hands and promise me that whether we had kids biologically, through adoption, or just remained the 2 of us forever, he'd be happy as long as we were together. By our 3rd year of trying, the strain was starting to show. Not in our love for each other, but in the constant undercurrent of hope and disappointment that colored every month. Our friends were having babies and moving into different phases of life while we remained stuck in this limbo of waiting and wanting. I threw myself into work, taking on more bookkeeping clients to distract myself from the baby clothes I'd see in store windows and the pregnancy announcements that filled my social media feeds. Mike responded by spending more time in his workshop, channeling his energy into creating beautiful furniture pieces that he'd donate to charity auctions or give to newlyweds in our community. I sometimes wondered if he was practicing for the day when he'd build cribs and toy boxes for our own children, but I never asked because the subject had become too tender for both of us. The October morning, when I finally saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, felt like winning the lottery and finding out miracles were real all at the same time. I was 28 years old, sitting on the bathroom floor of our little house at 6 in the morning, staring at a piece of plastic that held our entire future. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the test steady, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. After 3 years of negatives and maybes and crushing disappointments, I was finally genuinely, undeniably pregnant. I wanted to run through the house screaming with joy, but Mike was still asleep and I knew I wanted to tell him in a special way. He'd been so patient through every failed cycle, so supportive through every doctor's appointment and hormone injection and tearful breakdown. He deserved a moment as magical as what I was feeling. I spent the morning planning the perfect surprise, my heart racing with excitement every time I looked at that positive test sitting on our kitchen counter. Mike worked construction for Tom Henderson, who owned the biggest building company in our county. It was good, steady work that Mike genuinely enjoyed. He took pride in creating structures that would last for generations, and Tom seemed to appreciate Mike's attention to detail and strong work ethic. Mike would come home with stories about the houses they were building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, commercial projects they were completing, and the satisfaction he got from seeing something grow from blueprints into reality. That particular Tuesday, Mike had been working on a new shopping center project on the outskirts of town. He'd left early that morning, kissing me goodbye in the dark and promising to be home by 6 for dinner. I spent the entire day planning how I'd tell him about the pregnancy. I went to the store and bought ingredients for his favorite pot roast, picked up candles to make the dining room special, and even splurged on a small bouquet of flowers for our table. The hours dragged by like molasses as I prepared everything. I cleaned our already clean house twice, rearranged the living room furniture, and checked the clock every few minutes like that would somehow make Mike come home faster. By 4 o'clock, I had the pot roast in the oven, filling our house with the most incredible smells, candles arranged around our small dining room, and the pregnancy test wrapped in tissue paper, sitting next to his dinner plate with a note that simply said, "Daddy-to-be," in my best handwriting. When I heard Mike's truck pull into our driveway at exactly 6:15, my heart started racing like I was about to give a speech to 1,000 people. I positioned myself in the kitchen so I could watch his face when he saw the surprise, trying to contain the enormous smile that kept threatening to give everything away before he had a chance to discover it himself. Mike walked through our front door, looking like he always did after a long day of construction work. His brown hair was dusted with sawdust, and his work clothes were stained with concrete, but his green eyes were bright and happy to be home. He always had this way of leaving work stress at the front door and transforming back into the man who loved our quiet evenings together and our simple life on Maple Street. "Something smells incredible in here," he called out, dropping his lunchbox by the door and kicking off his work boots in the mudroom like he did every single day. "Did you make pot roast?" I tried to play it cool, calling back from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready and he should go wash up. But I couldn't keep the excitement out of my voice, and Mike knew me well enough to catch the subtle difference in my tone. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his eyebrows raised, and that half smile he got when he suspected I was up to something. "Okay, what's going on?" he asked, crossing his arms and looking at me with mock suspicion. "You're practically vibrating with excitement over there." I gestured toward the dining room with what I hoped was mysterious calm. "Just go sit down and you'll see." Mike's confusion turned to wonder when he saw our dining room transformed with candles and flowers. We weren't big on fancy romantic gestures in our everyday life, so this level of special occasion setup immediately signaled that something significant was happening. He looked back at me with questions in his eyes, but I just smiled and nodded toward his place at our small wooden table. When Mike saw the wrapped tissue paper next to his plate, he looked at me again with that questioning expression. "It's not my birthday," he said slowly. "And it's not our anniversary. What did I do to deserve whatever this is?" "Just open it," I said, my voice barely containing the joy that was threatening to burst out of me. Mike sat down and carefully unwrapped the tissue paper like he always did with presents, never tearing or rushing, but taking his time to savor the anticipation. When the pregnancy test tumbled out onto his plate, he stared at it for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 seconds. I watched his face transform as understanding dawned, his green eyes widening and his mouth falling slightly open. "Sarah," he whispered, picking up the test with hands that had started shaking. "Is this real? Are you really?" "I'm pregnant," I said, the words finally spilling out along with tears of joy I'd been holding back all day. We're going to have a baby, Mike. After all this time, it's finally happening. What happened next was pure magic. Mike dropped a pregnancy test back onto his plate and was across the room in 2 strides, picking me up and spinning me around our small kitchen while we both laughed and cried at the same time. He kept saying, "Really? And are you sure?" And, "Oh my God, Sarah," while I nodded and laughed and held on to him like he might disappear if I let go. When he finally set me down, Mike cupped my face in his hands and looked at me with more love and wonder than I'd ever seen in anyone's eyes. "We're going to be parents," he said softly, like he was testing how the words felt in his mouth. "I'm going to be a dad, and you're going to be a mom, and we're going to have a little person who's half you and half me." We spent that entire evening talking about everything and nothing related to the pregnancy. Mike kept touching my stomach even though there was nothing to feel yet, and we made lists of potential names that got sillier as the night went on. He talked about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery and building a crib that would be safe enough for his child and beautiful enough to become a family heirloom. I talked about taking prenatal vitamins and finding a good obstetrician and all the things I'd been researching during our years of trying. That night, lying in bed with Mike's hand resting protectively on my still flat belly, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. We'd weathered the storm of infertility and come out stronger on the other side. Now we were about to embark on the adventure we'd been dreaming about for 3 years. Everything felt perfect and possible and exactly as it should be. I had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, my perfect life would implode in ways I couldn't have imagined, in my worst nightmares. I had no idea that the man sleeping peacefully beside me, his hand still resting on our future child, was about to make a choice that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the person I'd pledged to spend my life with. The last thing Mike said to me that night, whispered into the darkness of our bedroom as we drifted off to sleep, was, "I promise you, Sarah, I'm going to be the best father this baby could ever ask for. Nothing in this world will ever hurt our family." Within 18 hours he would be gone, and I would spend the next 4 years believing that promise had been the cruelest lie anyone had ever told me. The next morning started like any other Wednesday in our little house on Maple Street. I woke up feeling slightly queasy, which I immediately attributed to morning sickness and felt a ridiculous surge of joy about. After 3 years of desperately wanting pregnancy symptoms, even nausea felt like a gift. Mike was already in the shower when I opened my eyes, and I could hear him humming off-key like he always did when he was in a particularly good mood. I padded to the kitchen to start coffee, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach the way it had been doing since seeing those pink lines. The pregnancy test was still sitting on our counter where we'd left it the night before, and seeing it there made everything feel real all over again. I was actually pregnant. We were actually going to be parents. After everything we'd been through, our miracle had finally arrived. Mike appeared in the kitchen dressed for work, his brown hair still damp from the shower, and his green eyes bright with the same joy that had been radiating from him since dinner the night before. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder, both of us looking down at my still flat belly. "How are you feeling this morning, Mama?" he asked softly, his hands splaying across my stomach like he was already protecting our baby. "Any morning sickness yet?" I leaned back against his chest, savoring the warmth and security of his embrace. "A little queasy, but in the best possible way," I told him. I never thought I'd be excited about feeling sick. Mike chuckled and turned me around in his arms, studying my face with the intense attention he usually reserved for blueprints and construction plans. "You look different," he said thoughtfully. "I can't put my finger on it, but there's something about your eyes. Maybe it's just because I know now, but you look like you're glowing from the inside." We spent those precious morning minutes talking about doctor's appointments and prenatal vitamins, and when we might start telling people our news. Mike was adamant that we should wait until after the first trimester, given our history of miscarriages. But I could tell he was just as excited as I was to start sharing our joy with the world. "I should probably call Dr. Martinez's office today and schedule an appointment," I said, mentally running through my to-do list. "And I need to start taking folic acid supplements." Mike nodded seriously, already shifting into protective mode. "Whatever you need, we'll get it. I want you to have the best prenatal care possible. This baby is going to be so healthy and so loved." He left for work that morning with extra kisses and promises to pick up prenatal vitamins on his way home. I watched his truck disappear down Maple Street and spent a few minutes just standing in our doorway, marveling at how different the world looked when you had everything you'd ever wanted finally within reach. The change started so subtly that I almost missed it at first. Mike came home that evening with the prenatal vitamins as promised, but something in his demeanor felt different. Not dramatically so, just a slight shift in the energy he carried through our front door. Instead of his usual enthusiastic greeting and request for details about my day, he seemed distracted and quiet. "How was work?" I asked as he kicked off his boots in the mudroom. The same question I asked every single day. "Fine," he replied, but his tone was flat in a way that was completely unlike him. Mike loved his job and usually came home with stories about what they were building, or problems they'd solved, or funny things that had happened on the job site. I attributed his mood to exhaustion. Construction work was physically demanding, and maybe the excitement of the pregnancy announcement had kept him from sleeping well. But over the next few days, Mike's behavior became increasingly strange in ways that I couldn't explain away with simple tiredness. He started coming home later from work, sometimes as much as an hour past his usual time. When I asked about the delays, he'd give vague explanations about overtime projects or equipment problems that needed attention. But his answers felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them on the drive home. The workshop became a forbidden zone almost overnight. For the 5 years we'd been married, Mike's converted garage workshop had been his happy place, where he'd retreat after dinner to work on furniture projects or repair neighbors' broken items. He'd always invited me out there to see what he was working on, proudly showing off a table he was refinishing or a bookshelf he was building from scratch. Now the workshop door stayed locked, and Mike would disappear out there for hours without explanation. When I casually mentioned that I hadn't seen his latest project, he'd brush off my questions with dismissive comments about it being nothing interesting or just some boring work stuff. The phone calls started during the second week after our pregnancy announcement. Mike had never been secretive about his phone conversations before. He'd answer calls from his boss or coworkers in front of me, discussing work schedules and project details without any concern for privacy. But these new calls were different. They came at odd hours and sent Mike scrambling to answer them in private. I'd catch him talking in hushed tones in our backyard, or stepping outside when his phone rang during dinner. The conversations were brief and tense, and Mike would return to the house looking troubled and distracted. When I asked who had called, he'd claim it was just work-related issues that weren't worth discussing. His sleep patterns changed too. Mike had always been a solid sleeper who could fall asleep within minutes of his head hitting the pillow and stay unconscious until his alarm went off. But now he was restless, tossing and turning beside me, and sometimes getting up in the middle of the night to pace around our house. I'd find him sitting at our kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring into space with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd insist he was just excited about the baby and having trouble sleeping, because his mind was racing with plans for our future. The most unsettling change was in how he looked at me. For 5 years, Mike had looked at me like I was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. His eyes would light up when I walked into a room, and he had this way of focusing on me completely when I was talking, like nothing else in the world mattered except what I had to say. But now, sometimes I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't love or joy or even concern. It was something sadder and more complex, like he was trying to memorize my face or like he was seeing me for the last time. When I confronted him about his strange behavior, Mike would deny that anything was wrong and try to redirect the conversation back to the pregnancy. He'd place his hands on my stomach and talk about nursery plans or baby names, but even his excitement about our child felt forced and desperate, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me that everything was normal. The breaking point came during our 3rd week of this bizarre new normal. I was in our bedroom folding laundry when I heard Mike's phone ring. Instead of answering it, he turned it off completely and sat staring at the black screen with an expression of such despair that it took my breath away. "Mike, what's going on?" I demanded, abandoning the laundry and sitting beside him on our bed. "And don't tell me it's nothing, because you've been acting like a completely different person for weeks." He looked at me then with those green eyes that had become so sad and distant, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me everything. His mouth opened like he was about to speak, and I could see him wrestling with something enormous and painful. But then he closed his mouth and shook his head. "I'm just stressed about work," he said finally. "Tom's been pushing everyone harder lately, and there's some politics happening at the company that I don't want to get caught up in." It was the most detailed explanation he'd given me in weeks, but it still felt incomplete. "What kind of politics?" I pressed. "Just boring construction industry stuff," Mike said, standing up and walking away from me. "Nothing you need to worry about. I'll figure it out." That night, Mike held me tighter than usual. As we lay in bed, his arms wrapped around me like he was afraid I might disappear. I could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles stayed coiled and ready even as he tried to relax into sleep. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered into the darkness. "Whatever happens, I need you to know that I love you and our baby more than anything in this world." The words should have been comforting, but something about the way he said them felt like goodbye. Like he was trying to leave me with something to hold on to when everything else fell apart. I pressed my face against his chest and listened to his heart beating strong and steady beneath my ear. "I love you too," I whispered back. "We're going to be okay, Mike. Whatever's bothering you, we'll figure it out together." But even as I said the words, I had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening to my husband was bigger than work stress or pregnancy anxiety. Something was terribly wrong, and Mike was carrying the weight of it alone, rather than trusting me enough to share the burden. I fell asleep that night with Mike's promise of love echoing in my ears and his arms holding me close. I had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, those arms would be gone and I'd be left trying to make sense of a goodbye that came without warning or explanation. Part 3. The morning everything ended. I woke up on Thursday morning to a bed that felt wrong before I was even fully conscious. The space beside me was cold. Not just empty, but cold in a way that meant Mike had been gone for hours. My hand reached automatically for his side of the mattress and found only cool sheets and the faint depression where his body should have been. The house felt different too, though I couldn't immediately pinpoint what had changed. There was a quality to the silence that was deeper than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath. No sound of shower running or coffee brewing, or Mike's off-key humming that typically served as my morning alarm clock. I sat up slowly, my hand moving instinctively to my still flat stomach as a wave of nausea washed over me. Morning sickness was becoming a regular part of my routine, and normally I'd call out to Mike to bring me saltine crackers from the kitchen. But the house felt so empty that I knew calling his name would only result in my voice echoing back unanswered. The clock on my nightstand read 7:30, which was unusual but not alarming. Mike sometimes left early when Henderson Building Company had a big project deadline, or when Tom needed him to supervise a crew at a distant job site. But he always left me a note on my nightstand, or kissed me goodbye, even if I was still sleeping. I shuffled to the bathroom, expecting to find a note stuck to the mirror, or his toothbrush still damp from use. Instead, I found a bathroom that looked strangely pristine. Mike's toothbrush was gone from the holder beside the sink. His deodorant was missing from the counter. The towel he'd used the night before was nowhere to be seen. My stomach dropped as I moved through our house, taking inventory of all the small details that were wrong. Mike's coffee mug wasn't in the sink or the dishwasher. His work boots weren't by the front door. His lunchbox wasn't on the counter where he always packed it the night before. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Tom had called with an emergency that required Mike to leave immediately. Maybe there had been an accident at one of their job sites and Mike had rushed out to help. Maybe his toothbrush had fallen behind the counter and I just hadn't noticed it yet. But when I looked out our front window and saw that Mike's truck was gone from our driveway, the first fingers of real panic started to close around my throat. Mike drove a distinctive blue pickup truck that was older than our marriage, but ran like a dream because he maintained it meticulously. That truck was never gone from our driveway unless Mike was driving it, and Mike was never gone in the morning without telling me where he was going. I called his cell phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. Mike's familiar voice asking callers to leave a message sounded normal and everyday, which somehow made everything feel more surreal. "Mike, it's me," I said after the beep, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. "I woke up and you were gone. I'm sure there's a good reason, but can you call me back and let me know what's going on? I'm starting to worry." I hung up and immediately called Henderson Building Company, thinking maybe Mike's supervisor could explain where he was and why he'd left so early. The phone rang several times before Tom Henderson's gruff voice answered. "Henderson Building, this is Tom." "Hi, Tom, this is Sarah Miller, Mike's wife. I'm looking for Mike and wondered if he'd come in early today." There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted just a beat too long. "Mike? No, haven't seen him this morning. Is everything okay?" "I'm sure it's fine," I said quickly, embarrassed to be calling my husband's workplace like an anxious teenager. "He left early, and I just wanted to make sure he'd made it to work safely." "Well, if he shows up, I'll have him call you," Tom said. "But, Sarah, I should mention that Mike put in his notice yesterday. Gave me a week's notice that he'd be leaving the company. Didn't he tell you?" The phone slipped in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. "What? No, he didn't mention anything about leaving his job. Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Tom replied, his tone becoming more concerned. He seemed upset about something, but he wouldn't say what, just said he needed to make some changes in his life. I figured you two had talked about it. I thanked Tom and hung up with my mind reeling. Mike had quit his job without telling me? The job he loved, the steady income we depended on, especially now with a baby coming? Nothing about this made any sense. I tried Mike's phone again and got the same voicemail. This time I didn't leave a message. Instead, I threw on clothes and drove to every place I could think of where Mike might be. The hardware store, where he bought supplies for his workshop projects. The diner, where he sometimes met coworkers for breakfast. The park, where we'd had our first date and still went sometimes to sit by the pond and talk. Every location was empty of my husband, and with each failed search, the panic in my chest grew tighter and more desperate. I drove past Henderson Building Company and didn't see his truck in the parking lot. I drove by his friend Jerry's house and found Jerry's wife, who told me she hadn't seen Mike in weeks. By noon, I was back home and calling Mike's phone every 15 minutes. Each call went straight to voicemail now, which meant he'd either turned his phone off or the battery had died. Neither option gave me any comfort. I searched our house more thoroughly, looking for clues about where Mike might have gone or why he'd left so suddenly. His dresser drawers were noticeably emptier. Several of his favorite shirts were gone, along with his good jeans and his winter jacket. But it wasn't like he'd packed everything. Most of his clothes were still there, hanging in our closet like he'd only planned to be gone for a few days. The bathroom confirmed my worst fears. Mike's toothbrush, deodorant, and shampoo were all gone. His prescription glasses were missing from the nightstand. These weren't items someone would take for a quick trip to the hardware store or an emergency call from work. I sat on our bed, surrounded by the evidence that my husband had deliberately packed some of his belongings and left our house while I was sleeping. The man who'd been over the moon about our pregnancy just 3 weeks earlier had snuck out of our home like a thief in the night, taking only what he could carry and leaving no explanation for his departure. The note appeared like a punch to the stomach when I returned to the kitchen for the 5th time that day. It was sitting on our small dining table, right where we'd shared our perfect pregnancy announcement dinner just 3 weeks earlier. A single sheet of white paper with Mike's careful handwriting that looked like it had been written in a hurry. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady enough to read it. The words swam in front of my eyes, but their meaning was crystal clear and devastating. "Sarah, I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. The baby deserves better than what I can give, and so do you. I'm not cut out to be a father or a husband. Don't try to find me because I won't be found. I'm sorry for everything. Mike." I read the note 5 times, then 10 times, then 20 times, as if reading it again would somehow change the words or reveal some hidden meaning that would make everything make sense. But the message was brutally simple and final. My husband, the man who'd cried with joy at our pregnancy announcement, who'd promised to be the best father our child could ask for, had decided he couldn't handle the responsibility and had run away, like a scared teenager. I called his phone again, and this time a recorded message informed me that the number was no longer in service. Mike had disconnected his phone, cutting off the last possible way for me to reach him, or for him to change his mind and come home. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disbelief and growing despair. I called every hospital in a 50-mile radius, convinced that there had to be some other explanation for Mike's disappearance. Maybe he'd been in an accident and was lying unconscious somewhere, unable to tell doctors who he was or how to contact his wife. But no hospitals had any record of anyone matching Mike's description being admitted. No police departments had reports of accidents involving blue pickup trucks. No morgues had unidentified bodies that could possibly be my husband. Mike had simply vanished, taking his truck and some of his belongings and leaving behind a pregnant wife who was now questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she'd married. The note sat on our kitchen table like evidence of a crime, proof that the life I'd thought we were building together had been nothing more than an illusion that Mike had shattered with a few devastating sentences. As night fell on that horrible Thursday, I sat in our dark living room holding Mike's note and trying to understand how a man could go from promising to be the best father in the world to abandoning his pregnant wife in the span of 3 weeks. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had, every strange behavior I'd noticed, every moment when he'd seemed distant or troubled. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had Mike been planning this escape from the moment I told him about the pregnancy? Had all his joy and excitement been an act designed to keep me from suspecting what he was really thinking? The man I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future and the life of our unborn child, had proven himself to be someone I didn't know at all. And as I sat alone in our empty house, I realized that my perfect life had been built on a foundation of lies that had crumbled the moment real responsibility appeared on the horizon. Part 4. The Aftermath of Abandonment. The first week after Mike's disappearance felt like living in a nightmare that refused to end. I kept expecting to wake up and find him making coffee in our kitchen, ready to apologize for the worst prank in the history of marriage. But every morning brought the same cold bed, the same empty house, and the same crushing reality that my husband had chosen to abandon his pregnant wife rather than face the challenges of fatherhood. I didn't tell anyone what had happened for the first 3 days. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud, as if speaking them would make Mike's abandonment more real than it already was. Instead, I called in sick to my bookkeeping clients and spent my days alternating between frantic phone calls to anyone who might know where Mike had gone and sitting motionless on our couch, staring at the note he'd left behind. My mother, Linda, was the first person I finally told, and her reaction was everything I'd feared it would be. She drove over to our house immediately after my tearful phone call, took one look at Mike's note, and launched into a tirade about men who couldn't handle responsibility and the patterns that seemed to run in our family. "I should have seen this coming," she said, pacing around our living room with the note clutched in her hand. "Men like Mike, they seem perfect until real life gets in the way. Your father pulled the same disappearing act when he found out I was pregnant with you." I'd known that my father had left when I was a baby, but my mother had always framed it as his choice to pursue a career opportunity in another state that gradually turned into permanent abandonment. Hearing her compare Mike's departure to my father's desertion felt like having a wound salted before it had time to form a scab. "Mike isn't like that," I protested, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. Something must have happened. People don't just change overnight from wanting to be a father to running away from responsibility. My mother's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Honey, I know you want to believe there's some explanation that makes this okay, but sometimes people show you who they really are when the pressure gets too high. Mike showed you who he is." The conversation with my sister Jenny was even more brutal in its honesty. Jenny had never been one to sugarcoat difficult truths, and she saw Mike's abandonment as proof of something she'd apparently suspected all along. "I always thought he was too good to be true," she said when I called to tell her what had happened. "The perfect husband who fixes everything and never complains and always says the right thing? Real men aren't like that, Sarah. Real men have flaws and problems and bad days." Mike was performing the role of perfect husband, and when real life got too complicated for his performance, he bailed. I wanted to argue with her, to defend the man I'd loved and trusted for 5 years, but I couldn't find the words to counter her logic. How could I explain that Mike really had been as wonderful as he'd seemed when the evidence suggested that everything about our marriage had been a lie? The hardest conversation was with Mike's friend Jerry, who worked with him at Henderson Building Company and had been the best man at our wedding. I'd hoped Jerry might have some insight into Mike's state of mind or might know where he'd gone. Instead, Jerry seemed as shocked and confused as I was. Mike never said anything to me about leaving, Jerry insisted when I called him. I mean, he'd been kind of quiet at work lately, but I figured that was just the pregnancy stress. Most guys get a little weird when they find out they're going to be dads. Did he mention any problems at work? I asked, grasping for any explanation that might make sense. Or any issues with Tom Henderson? Jerry paused thoughtfully. Well, there was some weird stuff happening with some of the projects we've been working on. Mike seemed concerned about some of the materials we were using, said they didn't meet the specifications in the contracts. But that's just Mike being detail-oriented. He always cared more about quality than the rest of us. It was the first piece of information that suggested Mike might have been dealing with work stress beyond normal pregnancy anxiety, but it still didn't explain why he'd choose to disappear rather than talk to me about his concerns. The pregnancy added another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. I was supposed to be celebrating the miracle we'd waited 3 years to achieve, but instead I was dealing with the shame and logistics of being abandoned while carrying my husband's child. Every pregnancy symptom felt like a reminder of what Mike had walked away from. Every prenatal appointment felt like a public announcement of my status as a woman who couldn't keep her husband interested enough to stick around for fatherhood. Dr. Martinez, my obstetrician, was kind but concerned when I showed up for my first appointment without Mike and had to explain that he wouldn't be involved in the pregnancy. She recommended counseling and support groups for single mothers, resources I'd never imagined needing when I'd made this appointment with such joy just 2 weeks earlier. Pregnancy is stressful enough without having to deal with relationship upheaval, Dr. Martinez said gently. I want to make sure you're taking care of your emotional health as well as your physical health. I appreciated her concern, but I couldn't bring myself to join support groups or seek counseling. I wasn't ready to accept that I was a single mother. Some part of me was still holding on to the hope that Mike would come to his senses and return home with an explanation that would make everything okay again. The financial reality of Mike's abandonment hit me gradually as bills came due, and I realized that my part-time bookkeeping income wasn't going to be enough to maintain our household expenses. Mike's paycheck from Henderson Building Company had covered our mortgage and utilities, while my income had paid for groceries and savings. Now I was facing the prospect of supporting myself and preparing for a baby on roughly half of our previous income. I called the mortgage company to explain my situation and see if there were any options for temporary payment reduction. The customer service representative was sympathetic but firm about the fact that the mortgage was in both Mike's name and mine, which meant I was responsible for the full payment regardless of his absence. Has your husband filed for divorce? The representative asked. Because if he has, that might affect how we handle the property division. The question hit me like a physical blow. In all my anguish over Mike's disappearance, I hadn't even considered the legal implications of his abandonment. Were we still married if he'd simply left? Did I need to file for divorce to protect myself financially? Did Mike have legal rights to our house and our bank accounts even though he'd chosen to abandon his family? I made an appointment with a family law attorney in Cedar Falls, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in divorce and custody cases. She listened to my story with professional sympathy and then delivered news that made my situation even more complicated. Without knowing where your husband is or why he left, we can't proceed with divorce papers, she explained. We can file for divorce based on abandonment, but we need to make a good faith effort to locate him and serve him with papers before the court will grant a default judgment. The thought of hiring a private investigator to track down the man who'd deliberately disappeared from my life felt both necessary and humiliating. I was going to have to pay someone to find my husband so I could legally divorce him for abandoning me. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. What about the baby? I asked. What are my rights regarding custody and child support? Ms. Chen's expression grew more sympathetic. If your husband has truly abandoned you and doesn't contest paternity, you'll likely be awarded full custody by default. As for child support, we can pursue that once we locate him and establish his income. But I have to warn you that collecting support from someone who's deliberately hiding can be very difficult. I left her office with a stack of paperwork, and the understanding that Mike's abandonment was going to have legal and financial consequences that could take years to resolve. The man who'd promised to love and protect me had left me with a mess that would require lawyers and private investigators and court appearances to untangle. The gossip in Cedar Falls started almost immediately after word got out that Mike had left town. In a community where everyone knew everyone's business, a husband abandoning his pregnant wife was the kind of scandal that provided weeks of material for coffee shop conversations and church social gatherings. I could feel the stares and whispered conversations when I went to the grocery store or the post office. People who'd known Mike and me as a couple for 5 years suddenly didn't know how to act around me. Some offered sympathy and support, while others seemed to view Mike's departure as evidence of some failing on my part. Mrs. Henderson, Tom's wife, cornered me at the pharmacy one afternoon with what she probably thought was helpful advice. "You know, dear, sometimes when men get scared about becoming fathers, they just need some time to work through their feelings. Maybe Mike will come back when he's ready." I wanted to scream at her that good men don't work through their feelings about fatherhood by abandoning their pregnant wives, but I just smiled politely and escaped as quickly as possible. The last thing I needed was for Tom Henderson's wife to think I was unstable or unreasonable. The worst part of the gossip wasn't what people said to my face, but what I imagined they were saying behind closed doors. I pictured neighbors speculating about what I might have done to drive Mike away. I imagined coworkers wondering if there was more to the story than I was telling. I felt like I was living under a microscope, with every emotion and reaction being analyzed for clues about my role in my husband's departure. By the end of the first month, I'd hired a private investigator named Robert Kane, who specialized in finding missing persons. He was a former police detective who'd started his own agency after retiring from the Cedar Falls Police Department. He listened to my story with professional detachment and then asked for every piece of information I could provide about Mike's habits, friends, interests, and possible destinations. "Most people who disappear voluntarily don't go far," he told me during our initial consultation. "They usually stay within a few hundred miles of home and try to maintain some version of their previous lifestyle. Your husband worked construction, so he'll probably look for similar work somewhere else." Kane requested photographs of Mike, his truck, and any documentation I could provide about his employment history and personal connections. He charged $200 a day plus expenses, money I couldn't really afford but felt I had to spend if I wanted any hope of legal resolution. After 6 weeks of investigation, Kane delivered his first report, and it was devastating in its completeness. Mike's trail had gone completely cold after leaving Cedar Falls. His truck hadn't been spotted by any law enforcement agencies. He hadn't applied for employment with any construction companies in Iowa or neighboring states. He hadn't used any credit cards or accessed any bank accounts since the day he'd disappeared. "It's like he planned this very carefully," Kane told me. "He's either using a false identity, or he's working for cash only in some location where nobody knows who he is. This level of disappearance takes planning and preparation." The implication was clear. Mike hadn't left on impulse or in a moment of panic. He'd thought about abandoning his family and had made deliberate preparations to ensure he couldn't be found. The man I'd trusted with my heart and my future had been planning his escape while I was celebrating our pregnancy and dreaming about our life together. As my first trimester progressed and my pregnancy became visible to the outside world, I had to face the reality that I was going to have this baby alone. Mike wasn't coming back with apologies and explanations. He wasn't going to show up at the hospital when our child was born. He'd made his choice, and that choice was a life without me and without the baby we'd created together. The loneliness was crushing and constant. I'd wake up reaching for someone who wasn't there, and fall asleep every night wondering how the person I'd loved most in the world had turned out to be someone I didn't know at all. Every kick I felt from our growing baby was a reminder of the father who'd chosen not to be there to feel those miraculous movements himself. Part 5. Building a life from the wreckage. By the time I entered my second trimester, I'd made the painful decision to stop looking for Mike and start building a life for myself and my baby that didn't depend on his return. The private investigator had found nothing after 3 months of searching, and continuing to chase ghosts was draining both my bank account and my emotional reserves. I threw myself into preparing for single motherhood with the same determination I'd once applied to trying to get pregnant. If I was going to raise this child alone, I was going to do it right, and that meant creating stability and security that didn't rely on anyone but myself. The first major decision was whether to stay in Cedar Falls or move somewhere new where I could start fresh without the constant reminder of my failed marriage and the whispers that followed me everywhere I went. The practical side of me argued for staying put. I had clients who depended on my bookkeeping services, a house with a mortgage I could barely afford, and a support system of family and friends who cared about me despite their awkward attempts at comfort. But the emotional side of me wanted desperately to escape to somewhere I could be just Sarah, pregnant woman, instead of Sarah, the woman whose husband abandoned her. I spent weeks researching other small towns in Iowa and Minnesota where I might be able to start over, but every time I came close to making plans to move, the logistics overwhelmed me. Moving would mean finding new clients, establishing new credit, leaving behind the few people who actually knew and cared about me. And there was always the possibility, however remote, that Mike might try to come back and find me gone. Despite everything he'd put me through, some part of me wasn't ready to close that door completely. I decided to stay in Cedar Falls, but to reclaim the narrative of my life in ways that made me feel less like a victim and more like a woman who was choosing her own path. I started by redecorating our house to remove some of the traces of Mike's presence that made every room feel like a memorial to our failed marriage. I painted the living room a soft yellow instead of the blue Mike had preferred. I rearranged the furniture to create new conversation areas that didn't remind me of where we used to sit together watching television or reading. I took down most of the photos of us as a couple and replaced them with pictures of my family and artwork that reflected my own taste rather than our shared preferences. The hardest room to tackle was our bedroom, where Mike's absence was most acutely felt every night. I couldn't afford to replace our bedroom furniture, but I bought new bedding in colors that felt more like me and rearranged the layout so that the empty side of the bed wasn't the first thing I saw when I woke up each morning. The spare bedroom that Mike and I had planned to convert into a nursery became my new project and my therapy. I spent my evenings after work researching cribs and changing tables, reading reviews of baby monitors and strollers, and slowly accumulating the items I'd need to care for our child. Shopping for baby supplies as a single mother required a different kind of emotional fortitude than I'd expected. I'd imagined browsing baby stores with Mike, debating the merits of different car seat brands, and choosing between paint colors for nursery walls. Instead, I found myself making these decisions alone, while surrounded by couples who were sharing the excitement I'd thought would be mine. The baby store salespeople were always kind, but clearly confused by my situation. They'd ask where my husband was, and then awkwardly redirect their questions when I explained that I was doing this alone. I developed a standard response that was truthful without being overly detailed. The baby's father isn't involved, so I'm handling the preparations myself. My mother tried to help by accompanying me on some of these shopping trips, but her presence sometimes made things more difficult. She had strong opinions about everything from stroller brands to nursery themes, and she frequently made comments about how different this experience was from what she'd imagined for my first pregnancy. Her well-meaning attempts to fill the void left by Mike's absence only served to highlight how fundamentally wrong everything had gone. The financial challenges of preparing for a baby alone forced me to become more resourceful and independent than I'd ever been in my life. I started taking on additional bookkeeping clients, working longer hours to build up savings for maternity leave, and the countless expenses that would come with a newborn. My days began at 5 in the morning and often didn't end until 10 at night, but the exhaustion was preferable to the anxiety of wondering how I'd support myself and a baby on my reduced income. I discovered a whole network of resources for single mothers that I'd never known existed. There were consignment shops that specialized in baby items where I could buy cribs and high chairs for a fraction of retail price. There were support groups at the community center where women shared advice about everything from childcare options to government assistance programs. There were online forums where single mothers exchanged tips about managing finances and dealing with the emotional challenges of raising children alone. These resources were invaluable, but using them required me to accept an identity I'd never imagined for myself. I was no longer part of a couple planning for their first child. I was a single mother preparing to raise a baby whose father had chosen not to be involved. The shift in how I saw myself and how others saw me was profound and sometimes painful. Dr. Martinez remained concerned about my stress levels throughout the second trimester and frequently asked about my emotional support system. She recommended prenatal yoga classes and meditation techniques designed to help manage anxiety during pregnancy. While I appreciated her concern for my mental health, I found it difficult to participate in activities designed for expectant couples when my own situation was so different from the norm. The prenatal classes offered through the hospital were particularly challenging. I signed up for a series of childbirth preparation classes, thinking it would be important to understand what to expect during labor and delivery. The first class was filled with couples holding hands and sharing excited glances as the instructor explained the stages of labor. I sat alone at a table meant for two, taking notes and trying to ignore the sympathetic looks from other participants. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Beverly who'd been teaching these classes for 20 years, tried to be inclusive by asking questions that didn't assume everyone had a partner present. But the entire curriculum was designed around the concept of having a support person present during labor, and I found myself wondering who would drive me to the hospital when the time came, and who would hold my hand during contractions. During the third class, Beverly approached me after the other couples had left and gently asked about my birth plan. "Do you have someone who can be your labor coach?" she asked kindly. "A family member or friend who can fill that role?" I'd been dreading this conversation, but I appreciated her direct approach. "My mother will probably be there," I said, though the idea of my anxious, emotional mother coaching me through childbirth felt less than ideal. "And my sister, maybe." Beverly nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered hiring a doula? There are several in the area who work specifically with single mothers or women whose partners can't be present for various reasons. They're trained to provide both physical and emotional support during labor." The suggestion made sense practically, but emotionally it felt like another reminder of how different my experience was going to be from what I'd planned. I was going to pay a stranger to provide the support that should have come from the man who'd helped create this baby. Still, I appreciated Beverly's pragmatic approach to my situation, and I made a note to research doulas in the Cedar Falls area. As spring turned to summer, and my pregnancy progressed into the third trimester, I began to feel a different kind of strength, emerging from the wreckage of my marriage. The constant anxiety about Mike's whereabouts, and the possibility of his return, had gradually given way to a more settled acceptance of my circumstances. I was going to be a single mother, and while that wasn't what I'd planned, I was capable of handling it. The baby's movements became stronger and more frequent as summer progressed, and I found myself having conversations with my unborn child during the quiet evening hours when loneliness felt most acute. I'd rest my hands on my growing belly and tell our baby about the nursery I was preparing, the books I planned to read aloud, and the adventures we'd have together as a team of two. These one-sided conversations helped me begin to see my situation less as abandonment and more as an opportunity to build the kind of relationship with my child that wasn't complicated by the dynamics of a troubled marriage. My baby would know from the very beginning that they were wanted and loved, and that their mother had chosen to fight for their future, even when circumstances became difficult. I started keeping a pregnancy journal, writing letters to my baby about the experience of carrying them and preparing for their arrival. The entries began as a way to document the physical changes and milestones of pregnancy, but they evolved into a more complex record of my emotional journey, from devastated wife to determined single mother. "Your daddy isn't here to feel you kicking," I wrote during one late-night session when the baby was particularly active, "but I want you to know that every movement you make fills me with joy and wonder. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, even though your arrival story isn't what I expected it to be." The journal became a safe space to express the complicated feelings I had about Mike's absence and what it meant for our child's future. I wrote about my anger at his choice to abandon us, my sadness about the father our baby would never know, and my determination to provide enough love and stability to compensate for his absence. As my due date approached in early September, I began to face the practical realities of labor and delivery as a single mother. I pre-registered at the hospital and filled out forms that asked for emergency contacts and birth plan preferences. In the space marked birth partner, I wrote my mother's name, though I harbored private doubts about her ability to remain calm and supportive during what was likely to be an intense and emotional experience. I packed my hospital bag with the items recommended in my pregnancy books: comfortable clothes for after delivery, toiletries, phone chargers, and snacks for the recovery period. But as I folded tiny newborn outfits and imagined bringing my baby home to the nursery I'd prepared alone, I felt the full weight of what Mike's abandonment had cost us. Our child would never have memories of their father's excitement about their birth. They'd never see photos of their parents together in the delivery room, tired but ecstatic after bringing their baby into the world. They'd never hear stories about how their daddy cried when he first held them, or how proud he was to show them off to friends and family. The loss wasn't just mine. Mike had chosen to miss one of the most profound experiences of his life, and our child would grow up with questions about their father that I couldn't answer, and a hole in their family story that nothing could fill. I decided to have the baby's birth announcement cards made without any mention of their father. The cards featured a simple design with our baby's name, birth date, weight, and length, along with my name as the proud mother. It felt important to claim this moment as ours, rather than continuing to leave space for someone who'd chosen not to be present. The nursery was completed by late August, painted in soft green with white furniture that would work for either a boy or a girl. I'd chosen not to learn the baby's gender during my ultrasounds, partly because I wanted the surprise, and partly because making that discovery alone felt too sad. The mystery of my baby's identity was one of the few aspects of this pregnancy that remained purely joyful and untainted by Mike's absence. I hung pictures on the nursery walls that depicted scenes of adventure and discovery: hot air balloons floating over landscapes, ships sailing toward distant horizons, and children exploring magical forests. I wanted my child's room to reflect the sense of possibility and adventure that I hoped would characterize their life, despite the challenging circumstances of their beginning. The mobile hanging over the crib played a gentle lullaby that I'd chosen specifically because it reminded me of my own childhood. I wanted to create traditions and memories for my baby that were rooted in my own family history, rather than dwelling on the traditions that Mike's absence had made impossible. In late August, I received a letter from the private investigator I'd hired months earlier. Robert Kane had continued his search for Mike despite my decision to stop actively pursuing leads, and he'd finally found something that provided a partial answer to the mystery of my husband's disappearance. "Mrs. Miller," the letter began, "I wanted to update you on my investigation into your husband's whereabouts. While I haven't been able to locate Mr. Miller directly, I have discovered some information that may explain his sudden departure from Cedar Falls." Quote, Kane went on to explain that he'd been investigating Henderson Building Company as part of his search for Mike, and had discovered irregularities in their business practices that suggested possible fraud or illegal activity. He'd found evidence that the company had been using substandard materials on several major construction projects, and had been involved in insurance claims that appeared suspicious. "It's possible that your husband became aware of these irregularities and left town to avoid being implicated in any illegal activity," Kane wrote. Construction industry fraud investigations can take years to resolve and often result in serious criminal charges for everyone involved, including employees who may have been unaware of the full scope of the illegal activity. The letter concluded with Kane's recommendation that I contact law enforcement if I wanted to pursue the matter further, but he cautioned that such investigations could take years and might not result in any useful information about Mike's current location. Reading Kane's letter, I felt a complex mix of relief and frustration. If Mike had left to avoid legal trouble rather than simply to escape fatherhood, it suggested that his departure might not have been entirely about his feelings toward me and our baby. But it also meant that he'd chosen to handle a difficult situation by running away, rather than facing it honestly or seeking help from people who cared about him. I decided not to pursue the matter further with law enforcement. Whatever Mike's reasons for leaving, the effect on me and our baby was the same. We'd been abandoned, and we'd learned to survive and thrive without him. Reopening that wound to satisfy my curiosity about his motivations didn't seem worth the potential disruption to the life I'd worked so hard to build. Instead, I focused my energy on the final preparations for our baby's arrival. I attended my last prenatal appointments, finalized my maternity leave arrangements with my bookkeeping clients, and tried to rest as much as possible in the final weeks of pregnancy. My mother had become increasingly excited about becoming a grandmother as my due date approached, and her enthusiasm helped offset some of the sadness I felt about Mike's absence. She'd started buying baby clothes and toys with an intensity that suggested she was trying to compensate for the missing grandfather, and while her efforts sometimes felt overwhelming, I appreciated her commitment to being involved in her grandchild's life. Jenny had also stepped up her support in the final weeks of my pregnancy, calling regularly to check on me and offering to help with anything I needed after the baby arrived. She'd arranged to take time off work to stay with me during the first week after delivery, and knowing I'd have that support made me feel more confident about managing the early days of motherhood alone. The final month of pregnancy brought a strange sense of peace, despite the physical discomfort and anticipation. I'd survived the worst crisis of my life, and emerged stronger and more self-reliant than I'd ever imagined possible. I was about to become a mother, and while the circumstances weren't what I'd planned, I felt ready for the challenge and excited about the future I was going to build with my child. The nursery was ready, my hospital bag was packed, and I'd made all the practical arrangements necessary for bringing a baby home alone. But more importantly, I'd made the emotional journey from devastated wife to confident single mother, and I felt genuinely excited about meeting the little person who'd been my constant companion through the most difficult period of my life. My baby had been with me through Mike's abandonment, through the gossip and whispers of our small town, through the financial stress and legal complications of single motherhood, and through the long process of rebuilding my life from scratch. They'd felt my tears during the darkest moments, and my laughter during times of hope and healing. In a few weeks, I'd finally get to hold them and begin the next chapter of our story together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them as a team, and that knowledge filled me with a strength and confidence I'd never possessed when my happiness depended on someone else's presence in my life. The workshop in our garage remained locked, just as Mike had left it. I'd avoided that space throughout my pregnancy, unable to face whatever projects or reminders he'd left behind. But as I prepared for our baby's arrival, I began to think about what I'd eventually do with that room. Maybe it could become a playroom when our child was older, or perhaps a space where I could pursue my own hobbies and interests. The locked workshop had become a symbol of the life Mike had abandoned, but I was beginning to see it as a space with potential for new purposes and new memories. Like everything else in my life, it would eventually be transformed from a reminder of what I'd lost into something that served my future and my child's future. As I entered my final month of pregnancy, I felt ready to close the door on the woman I'd been when I was married to Mike, and fully embrace the woman I'd become through surviving his abandonment. I was stronger, more independent, and more confident in my own judgment than I'd ever been before. My baby was going to be born to a mother who'd already proven she could handle whatever life threw at her, and that felt like the best possible foundation for the adventure we were about to begin together. Sophie Elizabeth Miller arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in September. After 18 hours of labor that tested every ounce of strength I'd built up over the previous months. My mother held my hand through the contractions while Jenny paced the hospital corridor, and when the doctor finally placed my daughter on my chest, I understood for the first time what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. She was perfect in every way that mattered, with a shock of dark hair that reminded me painfully of Mike and green eyes that were unmistakably his. But when she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine and looked up at me with that unfocused newborn gaze, I knew that whatever resemblance she bore to her father, she was completely and utterly mine. The first year of Sophie's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights, first smiles, and the constant juggling act of single motherhood. I'd arranged to work from home as much as possible, spreading my bookkeeping clients' work across early mornings and evening hours when Sophie was sleeping. The financial strain was constant but manageable, and I took pride in the fact that we were not just surviving but actually thriving in our little house on Maple Street. Sophie was an easy baby in many ways, content to lie in her bouncer while I worked at my computer, and quick to settle into predictable routines that made my work schedule possible. But she was also curious and alert in ways that reminded me constantly of the father she'd never met. She had Mike's intense way of studying new objects and his stubborn determination when she wanted something just out of reach. By the time Sophie turned 2, she'd begun asking the inevitable questions about her daddy that I'd been dreading since her birth. "Where, Daddy?" became her favorite inquiry, usually delivered with the persistent intensity that only toddlers could muster. I developed a standard response that was truthful without being devastating. "Daddy had to go away before you were born, but Mommy loves you enough for both of us." The answer satisfied her for a while, but as Sophie approached her 3rd birthday, her questions became more sophisticated and harder to deflect. She'd noticed that other children at daycare had fathers who came to pick them up or attended birthday parties, and she wanted to know why her family looked different from everyone else's. "Did my daddy not want me?" she asked one evening as I was giving her a bath, the question delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that children used for their most heartbreaking inquiries. I stopped washing her hair and looked into those green eyes that were so much like Mike's, it sometimes took my breath away. "Your daddy wanted you very much," I said carefully, which was true based on his reaction to the pregnancy news. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that are too big for them to handle, and they make choices that hurt the people they love. Sophie considered this explanation with the seriousness she applied to all new information. "Will my daddy come back when his problems get smaller?" The question hung in the humid air of our small bathroom, and I realized that my 3-year-old daughter had just asked the same thing I'd been wondering for over 4 years. I didn't have an answer for her that wouldn't either give false hope or crush the natural optimism that children carried about their parents. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said finally, "but I do know that we're a perfect family just the way we are." As Sophie's 4th birthday approached in September, I began to feel the weight of decisions I'd been postponing since Mike's disappearance. The house needed repairs that I couldn't afford on my income, and the mortgage payments were becoming harder to manage as my bookkeeping business faced competition from larger firms that could offer services I couldn't match working from home. Real estate prices in Cedar Falls had increased significantly since Mike and I had bought the house, which meant I had enough equity to consider selling and moving somewhere with lower living costs. But selling would mean dealing with the legal complications of a missing spouse, and the emotional challenge of dismantling the last physical connection to the life I'd planned with Mike. The garage workshop had remained locked for 4 years, and I'd successfully avoided dealing with whatever Mike had left behind. But potential buyers would want to see every part of the property, which meant I'd finally have to face the contents of that space and decide what to do with Mike's tools and unfinished projects. The decision to finally open the workshop came on a Saturday morning in October when Sophie was playing in our backyard and asked if there were toys in the locked room that she could play with. I deflected similar questions before, but something about the way she asked, combined with my growing need to make decisions about our future, finally gave me the courage to face whatever Mike had left behind. I told Sophie to stay in the backyard where I could see her through the window, and I walked to the garage with the spare key I'd kept hidden under the paint can shelf for 4 years. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the lock, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could bring myself to push the door open. The workshop wasn't what I'd expected to find after 4 years of abandonment. Instead of dust-covered tools and projects left to deteriorate, I found a space that looked like it had been maintained recently. Mike's tools hung in perfect rows on the pegboard he'd installed, organized with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always brought to his work. But what made me sink onto his workbench stool in complete shock were the dozens of handcrafted wooden toys scattered throughout the space. Beautiful, intricate pieces that would have taken months or even years to complete. A dollhouse that looked like something from a fairy tale, complete with tiny furniture and delicate window boxes. Building blocks carved with letters and numbers in a font that looked like Mike's careful printing. A rocking horse so detailed it seemed alive, with a flowing mane and gentle expression. Every single piece was signed in Mike's unmistakable handwriting. "For Sophie. With all my love, Daddy." I walked around the workshop in a daze, touching each toy and trying to understand what I was seeing. If Mike had abandoned us, why would he have spent what must have been hundreds of hours creating toys for a daughter he'd chosen never to meet? And, more confusing still, how was this workshop so clean and organized after 4 years of being locked and supposedly unused? There wasn't a speck of dust on any surface. The tools looked like they'd been used recently and carefully cleaned. Even the small window had been washed, allowing afternoon sunlight to stream across Mike's workbench, where I found project plans and sketches for additional toys that hadn't been completed yet. The plans were dated, and as I examined them more closely, I realized that some were from just a few weeks ago. Someone had been in this workshop recently, working on projects and maintaining the space with the same care Mike had always brought to his craftsmanship. I found a calendar hanging beside the workbench with dates marked in Mike's handwriting. The entries were cryptic but regular, appearing about once a month for the past 4 years. S's growth spurt was noted in March. Started walking, appeared in September 2 years ago. First words, Mama, was written in October of that same year. Someone had been documenting Sophie's milestones, and the handwriting was unmistakably Mike's. But how could he have known about her development if he'd truly abandoned us? How could he have been tracking her growth and creating toys for her, while maintaining complete silence about his whereabouts? I sat on Mike's work stool, surrounded by evidence that nothing about his disappearance was as simple as I'd believed for 4 years. The man I'd convinced myself was a coward who couldn't handle fatherhood had apparently been crafting toys for his daughter and somehow monitoring her development from a distance. My mind raced through possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. Had Mike been living somewhere nearby all this time? Had he been watching Sophie grow up without revealing himself? Was it possible that his disappearance hadn't been abandonment at all, but something far more complicated? I called my friend Maria, whose brother Carlos ran an antique appraisal business in nearby Waterloo. I needed someone with expertise to look at these toys and help me understand what I was dealing with before I made any decisions about what to do with them. I need someone to look at some handmade furniture and toys, I told Carlos when he answered his phone. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I decide whether to keep them or sell them. Carlos agreed to come over the following Monday, and I spent the weekend trying to process what I'd discovered in the workshop. I didn't tell Sophie about the toys yet, unsure how to explain their existence without raising questions about her father that I still couldn't answer. The dollhouse in particular haunted me. It was an exact replica of our house on Maple Street, complete with miniature versions of our furniture, and even tiny versions of Sophie's toys scattered around the small rooms. Someone had studied our home in incredible detail to create such an accurate reproduction, which suggested a level of ongoing observation that made me deeply uncomfortable. When Carlos arrived Monday afternoon, he whistled low when he saw the collection of toys and furniture pieces scattered around the workshop. He examined each piece carefully, taking photographs and making notes about the craftsmanship and materials. Sarah, these aren't just toys, he said, running his hands over the intricate dollhouse. This is museum-quality work. Whoever made these has serious talent and spent serious time on each piece. The attention to detail is extraordinary. He picked up the dollhouse to examine it more closely, and his expression changed. This house is weighted wrong, he said, turning it over to study the base. There's something inside here that's making it heavier than it should be. My heart started pounding as Carlos felt around the dollhouse's foundation, looking for hidden compartments or secret panels. After several minutes of careful examination, he found a small, nearly invisible seam and carefully pried it open. Inside was a metal box about the size of a jewelry case, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. Carlos looked at me with serious eyes before carefully lifting it out of the hidden compartment. Sarah, I think you should call the police before we open this, he said quietly. Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right. Either your husband has been coming back here without you knowing, or someone else has been using this space. Either way, that's something the authorities should know about. I called the Cedar Falls Police Department, and Detective Lisa Murphy arrived within an hour. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind but sharp eyes, who immediately understood Carlos's concern when she saw the workshop and heard my story. Mrs. Miller, I need to ask you something important, she said after photographing the space and the hidden compartment. Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have had a reason to hurt him or threaten your family? The question seemed absurd. Mike? No, everyone loved Mike. He was the guy who helped neighbors with their projects and coached kids baseball. Why would you ask that? Detective Murphy carefully examined the metal box with gloved hands. Because husbands don't usually maintain secret workshops for 4 years after abandoning their families. And they don't usually hide mysterious boxes and dollhouses they've made for children they've supposedly never met. Something else is going on here. She opened the metal box with careful precision, revealing contents that made my blood run cold. Inside were items that told a story I'd never imagined. A sealed envelope addressed to me in Mike's handwriting. Multiple USB drives labeled with dates spanning the past 4 years. Photographs of men I didn't recognize. A small digital recorder. Bank statements for accounts I'd never heard of. And a spare cell phone. Detective Murphy played the digital recorder first, and Mike's voice filled the workshop for the first time in 4 years. He sounded older, more tired than I remembered, but it was unmistakably him. If something happens to me, Sarah needs to know I didn't abandon her and Sophie. I've been documenting everything for 4 years, but they're getting suspicious. I tried to stay completely away to keep them safe, but I couldn't stop watching over them. Sophie is so beautiful, Sarah. She looks just like you, but she has my stubborn chin. I felt my legs give out and had to sit down hard on Mike's workbench. Detective Murphy paused the recording and looked at me with gentle eyes. Mrs. Miller, I don't think your husband abandoned you. I think he was trying to protect you. The USB drives contained 4 years of secretly recorded conversations and video footage. Mike had discovered that Henderson Building Company was involved in a massive insurance fraud scheme, using substandard materials on commercial projects, and then collecting huge payouts when the buildings inevitably failed inspections or suffered structural problems. The men in the photographs were his supervisors and co-workers, people I'd met at company barbecues who'd seemed like Mike's friends. Tom Henderson, the owner, had been running the operation for years, bribing building inspectors and falsifying safety reports, while putting countless lives at risk with dangerously constructed buildings. When Sarah told me she was pregnant, I heard Mike's voice explain through one of the recorded conversations. Everything changed. Tom made it clear that people who knew too much about the business either stayed silent or had, quote, accidents. He started making comments about what a pretty wife I had, how it would be terrible if something happened to our little family. Detective Murphy fast-forwarded through hours of recorded evidence while I sat in stunned silence. Mike had been building a case against Henderson Building Company, but when I got pregnant, Tom Henderson had made it clear that my safety and Sophie's safety depended on Mike's silence and cooperation. So we made a deal, Detective Murphy explained as we watched grainy footage of Mike secretly recording meetings with Henderson and his associates. He would disappear completely, fake his own abandonment, and in exchange, Henderson would leave you and Sophie alone. As far as Henderson knows, Mike abandoned his family and left Cedar Falls forever. The letter was 12 pages long, written in Mike's careful handwriting. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong with my plan to keep you and Sophie safe. I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was the only way to protect our family. Tom Henderson made it clear that if I ever went to the authorities about the insurance fraud, you and our baby would become targets. He described exactly where you shopped, what route you took to work, what time you walked in our neighborhood. He wasn't making empty threats. So I made a deal with the devil. I would disappear completely, no contact, no trace, and he would leave you both alone. As far as he knows, I abandoned my family and left town. But I couldn't really leave you, Sarah. I've been living in a cabin about 2 hours north, working construction under a false name. Every penny I earn goes into the account listed with these papers. It's for Sophie's college fund, for emergencies, for anything you both need. I come back to our house once a month, always in the middle of the night when you're both sleeping. I maintain the workshop and work on toys for our daughter. I watch Sophie play in our backyard sometimes, from the woods behind our house. She's so beautiful, Sarah. She has your smile and your determination. I know you must hate me. I know this looks like cowardice, like I chose the easy way out. But I promise you, every day away from you both is torture. I dream about reading Sophie bedtime stories, about teaching her to ride the bike I'm building for her 5th birthday, about growing old with you in our little house. The FBI contact information is in this box. When Sophie turns 18, or if something happens to me, please give them the evidence. These men need to be stopped. I love you both more than my own life. I never stopped being Sophie's daddy or your husband. Forever yours, Mike. The FBI investigation moved swiftly once they had Mike's evidence. Within 72 hours, they'd arrested Tom Henderson and 8 other men involved in the insurance fraud scheme. The operation had been responsible for millions in fraudulent claims and had put countless lives at risk with substandard construction that could have resulted in building collapses or other catastrophic failures. More importantly, they found Mike. He'd been living under the name Michael Santos in a small cabin outside Decorah, working construction for cash and sending every spare dollar to the secret account he'd set up for Sophie's future. When FBI agents knocked on his door, he thought his worst nightmare had come true, that the criminals had found him and would now target his family. Instead, they told him he was free. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while Sophie and I were reading bedtime stories in her room. When my phone rang and I saw an unknown number, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Sarah? The voice was rougher than I remembered, weathered by 4 years of guilt and loneliness, but unmistakably Mike's. I nearly dropped the phone. Sophie looked up from her picture book with curious eyes. "They said it's safe now," Mike whispered, his voice breaking. "They said I can come home. If you'll have me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know 4 years is too long to make up for, but I need you to know the truth." "Where are you?" I managed to ask. "About 2 hours away. But Sarah, I understand if you've moved on. I understand if Sophie doesn't want to know me. I just needed you to know that I never stopped loving you both." Sophie had climbed into my lap during the conversation, pressing her ear against the phone with the curiosity that characterized everything she did. "Who is it, Mommy?" she whispered. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful little girl who'd been asking about her daddy, and made the easiest decision of my life. "It's Daddy, sweetheart. Daddy's coming home." Mike arrived as the sun was setting, his old blue pickup truck pulling slowly into our driveway like he was afraid we might disappear if he moved too quickly. Sophie and I waited on the front porch, her small hand in mine as we watched the man who'd been absent from our lives for 4 years step out of his truck. He looked older, weathered by years of physical labor and emotional isolation. His brown hair was streaked with gray, and there were lines around his green eyes that hadn't been there when he'd left. But when he looked at Sophie, those eyes filled with the same wonder they'd held the night I told him I was pregnant. "Sophie," I said gently, "this is your daddy." She studied him for a long moment with the serious expression she got when meeting new people. Then, with the acceptance that only children possess, she let go of my hand and walked down our porch steps toward him. "Did you make the toys in the garage?" she asked, getting straight to what mattered most to a 4-year-old. Mike knelt down to her level, tears streaming down his face. "I made all of them. Every single toy. I've been waiting so long to meet you, princess." Sophie smiled, my smile but with his eyes, and reached out to hug the father who'd never really left, who'd been watching over us and loving us from a distance that must have felt like torture every single day. We had 4 years to rebuild, 4 years of trust to restore, 4 years of bedtime stories and birthday parties to make up for. But as I watched Mike hold our daughter for the first time, surrounded by the evidence of his love and sacrifice hidden in toys he'd crafted in secret, I knew we'd find our way back to each other. Sometimes the people we think have abandoned us are actually fighting harder than we know to protect us. And sometimes coming home means never having really left at all. The first few weeks after Mike's return were a delicate dance of relearning how to be a family while processing 4 years of separation and misunderstanding. Sophie, with the resilience that children possess, adapted to having a father with remarkable ease. But the emotional landscape for Mike and me was far more complex and fraught with the weight of everything we'd lost and everything we needed to rebuild. Mike moved back into our house gradually, starting with a few nights a week, and slowly extending his stays, as we all adjusted to the new dynamic. He'd been living alone for so long that even simple domestic sounds, the hum of the dishwasher or Sophie's laughter echoing through the hallways, seemed to overwhelm him with emotion. I'd catch him standing in doorways just listening, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to be part of our daily life again. Sophie's relationship with her father developed with an intensity that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. She'd spent 4 years creating an imaginary version of her daddy based on stories I'd told her and her own childhood fantasies, and now she was faced with a real person who was both exactly what she'd hoped for and completely different from what she'd expected. Mike, for his part, approached fatherhood with the careful reverence of someone who knew how close he'd come to losing the opportunity entirely. Their first real bonding moment happened in the workshop, surrounded by the toys Mike had crafted during his years of exile. Sophie examined each piece with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her, asking detailed questions about how he'd made the rocking horse's mane so smooth and why he'd chosen particular colors for the dollhouse furniture. "Did you know what I looked like when you made these?" she asked, running her small fingers over the intricate details of a carved wooden train set. Mike knelt beside her, his voice thick with emotion when he answered, "I watched you playing in our backyard sometimes, very late at night when you and Mommy were sleeping. I wanted to make toys that would make you happy, even if I couldn't be here to play with you." Sophie considered this information with the seriousness she applied to all new concepts. "Were you sad that you couldn't play with me?" "Every single day," Mike admitted. "But I knew that keeping you and Mommy safe was more important than what I wanted." She nodded as if this made perfect sense to her 4-year-old logic, then picked up a wooden puzzle he'd created with pieces shaped like different animals. "Will you show me how to put this together?" Watching them work on the puzzle together, their heads bent over the wooden pieces with identical expressions of concentration, I felt the first real stirring of hope that we might actually be able to repair what had been broken. But I also felt the weight of my own anger and hurt, emotions that couldn't be resolved as easily as a child's natural acceptance of her father's return. The truth about Mike's disappearance had recontextualized everything I'd believed about his character and his feelings for our family, but it hadn't erased the pain of 4 years spent believing I'd been abandoned. I'd built a life as a single mother, developed strength and independence I'd never known I possessed, and learned to find joy and purpose in a reality that didn't include him. Integrating him back into that life required adjustments that went far beyond the practical logistics of sharing space and parenting responsibilities. We started seeing a family therapist, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in helping families reunite after extended separations. She helped us navigate the complex emotions surrounding Mike's return and provided tools for rebuilding trust and communication that had been severed by years of silence. "Sarah, your anger is completely valid," Dr. Walsh said during one of our early sessions. "Even though Mike's reasons for leaving were protective rather than selfish, you still experienced abandonment. You still had to raise Sophie alone during some of the most challenging years of motherhood. Those experiences can't be dismissed just because the underlying circumstances were different from what you believed." Mike struggled with guilt that was so profound it sometimes seemed to paralyze him. He'd saved detailed records of Sophie's development over the years, notes about her first steps and first words that he'd gathered through careful observation from a distance. But he'd missed the daily moments that actually comprised her childhood. He'd missed bedtime stories and scraped knees and Christmas mornings and birthday parties. And no amount of explanation could give those experiences back to him. "I know I made the only choice I could make," he told Dr. Walsh during one particularly difficult session. "But that doesn't make it easier to live with what I missed." Sophie needed a father who was present, not a father who was protecting her from shadows she didn't even know existed. The financial investigation that followed the arrests at Henderson Building Company revealed just how dangerous Mike's situation had been. The insurance fraud scheme had been worth millions of dollars, and Tom Henderson had been willing to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the operation. 2 other employees who'd asked too many questions had died in what had been ruled accidents but were now being investigated as potential murders. Mike's decision to disappear rather than go to the authorities immediately had likely saved all our lives. But it had also allowed Henderson and his associates to continue their criminal activities for years longer than they might have otherwise. Learning about the scope of the danger we'd been in helped me understand Mike's choice intellectually, but it didn't immediately heal the emotional wounds caused by his absence. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive and complicated. Mike had to testify in multiple trials, reliving the threats and fear that had driven him into hiding. I had to face the reality that our quiet life in Cedar Falls had been built on a foundation of criminal activity that we'd been completely unaware of. The construction projects Mike had worked on, the paychecks that had supported our family, the community connections we'd thought were friendships, had all been part of a web of corruption that had ultimately torn our family apart. Sophie was too young to understand the complex legal and criminal aspects of what had happened, but she was old enough to sense the tension and emotion that surrounded her father's return. She began having nightmares about people taking her daddy away again, fears that required careful handling and constant reassurance that our family was safe now. We developed new routines that honored both the life I'd built as a single mother and the family unit we were trying to recreate. Mike respected the independence I'd developed during his absence and didn't try to immediately resume his role as head of the household. Instead, he integrated himself gradually into the systems and schedules that Sophie and I had established, finding ways to contribute without disrupting the stability we'd created. The workshop became a family space where Mike taught Sophie woodworking basics while I watched from the doorway, amazed by how naturally they worked together, despite their years of separation. Sophie had inherited Mike's patience and attention to detail, qualities that manifested in her careful sanding of small wooden blocks and her focused attention when he explained how different tools worked. "She's got good hands for this kind of work," Mike told me one afternoon as we watched Sophie use a child-sized sander to smooth the edges of a wooden toy car she was making. "She understands that good craftsmanship takes time and care." I could see him storing up these moments, treasuring each interaction with the desperate intensity of someone who knew how easily it could all be taken away. His hypervigilance about our safety remained high months after Henderson's arrest, and he installed security systems and changed our daily routines in ways that reflected his ongoing concern about potential retaliation from associates who might still be operating. The financial account Mike had maintained during his absence contained over $80,000, money he'd saved by living in Spartan conditions and working multiple jobs under his assumed identity. He'd intended it all for Sophie's education and our emergency needs, but I suggested we use part of it to take a family vacation, something we'd never done together, and something that might help us create new memories that weren't overshadowed by the trauma of our separation. We decided on a week at a cabin in northern Minnesota, far enough from Cedar Falls to feel like a genuine escape, but close enough that we could return quickly if Sophie became overwhelmed by being away from familiar surroundings. The cabin was rustic and peaceful, surrounded by woods that reminded Mike of the isolation he'd endured during his exile, but with the crucial difference that this time, he was sharing the experience with his family. Sophie thrived in the natural environment, collecting pine cones and smooth rocks, while Mike taught her to identify different types of trees and birds. I watched them explore the woods together, her small hand tucked trustingly in his larger one, and felt the first genuine moments of peace I'd experienced since his return. Away from the familiar spaces that carried so much emotional weight, we could focus on simply being together without the constant reminder of all the time we'd lost. The evenings at the cabin became precious opportunities for deeper conversations that were difficult to have at home, where daily responsibilities and external pressures intruded. Mike talked about his years of isolation, the jobs he'd worked under his false identity, and the overwhelming loneliness that had been his constant companion. I shared my own experiences of single motherhood, the strength I'd discovered in myself, and the ways that his absence had changed me in both positive and challenging ways. "I'm not the same person I was when you left," I told him one night as we sat on the cabin's porch while Sophie slept inside. "I had to become someone different to survive what happened. I don't know if the woman I am now is someone you can love the way you loved the woman I used to be." Mike was quiet for a long time before responding. "I fell in love with your strength and your determination long before you knew how strong you really were," he said finally. "Watching you raise Sophie alone, seeing how you built a life for both of you when you thought I'd abandoned you, just proved what I already knew about who you are at your core. If anything, I love you more now than I did before." The vacation helped us establish new patterns of communication and intimacy, but returning to Cedar Falls meant facing the ongoing challenges of rebuilding our relationship within the context of our real life. The community response to Mike's return was mixed, with some neighbors expressing relief and understanding, while others remained skeptical about the circumstances of his disappearance and return. Mrs. Henderson, Tom's wife, approached me at the grocery store a few weeks after we returned from our vacation, her face drawn with the weight of her husband's crimes and their impact on our family. "I had no idea what Tom was doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd known that Mike was being threatened, that your family was in danger, I would have done something to stop it. I believed her sincerity, but her words also highlighted how isolated Mike had been during his ordeal. He'd been carrying the burden of protecting us entirely alone, unable to trust anyone with the truth because the stakes were so high and the network of corruption so extensive. The psychological toll of that isolation was something we were still working to understand and address in our therapy sessions. Dr. Walsh helped us recognize that healing from our separation would be a long-term process that couldn't be rushed or forced. Trauma doesn't operate on a timeline, she explained. Even positive changes, like Mike's return, can be stressful because they require adjusting to new realities and letting go of coping mechanisms that served you well during difficult periods. One of the most challenging aspects of Mike's return was learning to trust him with Sophie's daily care. I'd been her sole caretaker for 4 years, making every decision about her health, education, and emotional well-being without consulting anyone else. Sharing that responsibility, even with her biological father, required me to relinquish control in ways that sometimes triggered my anxiety about her safety and well-being. Mike was patient with my reluctance to immediately trust him with certain aspects of Sophie's care, understanding that my protective instincts had been heightened by years of single motherhood. He earned my confidence gradually, proving his commitment through consistent daily actions rather than grand gestures or promises about the future. The first time he took Sophie to a doctor's appointment alone, I paced our house for the entire 2 hours they were gone, checking my phone obsessively for updates, even though I knew the visit was routine. When they returned with a clean bill of health and a story about how Sophie had impressed the pediatrician with her knowledge of different types of wood, I realized that my anxiety had more to do with my own fears than with any genuine concern about Mike's parenting abilities. Sophie's 5th birthday in September became a milestone that represented our family's progress toward healing and integration. We planned a party in our backyard, inviting friends and neighbors who'd supported us during Mike's absence and who were now helping us celebrate our reunion. Mike spent weeks preparing a special gift, a child-sized workbench with real tools scaled to Sophie's hands, complete with safety equipment and a set of projects designed to teach her basic woodworking skills. Watching Sophie's face light up when she saw the workbench, and seeing Mike's pride in her excitement, I felt something shift permanently in my understanding of our family's future. We weren't trying to recreate what we'd lost or return to who we'd been before his disappearance. We were building something new, incorporating the strength and independence I'd developed, the wisdom Mike had gained through his ordeal, and Sophie's natural resilience and adaptability. The criminal trials concluded in early winter, with Tom Henderson and his associates receiving lengthy prison sentences for fraud, conspiracy, and in Henderson's case, 2 counts of murder for the deaths of employees who'd threatened to expose the operation. Mike's testimony had been crucial in securing the convictions, but the process had required him to relive the threats and fear that had driven him into exile. The day the final verdicts were announced, Mike came home from court, looking simultaneously relieved and exhausted. "It's over," he told me, holding me close in our kitchen while Sophie played with blocks at our feet. "They can't hurt us anymore. We're finally free." But freedom from external threats didn't automatically resolve the internal challenges we continued to face as a family. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent effort to rebuild. Communication patterns that had been severed needed to be re-established through patient practice. The roles and responsibilities within our household needed to be renegotiated in ways that honored both our individual growth and our collective needs. By Sophie's 6th birthday, we'd found our rhythm as a reconstituted family. Mike had returned to construction work with a different company that emphasized ethical practices and transparency. I'd expanded my bookkeeping business and was considering pursuing additional education in financial planning. Sophie was thriving in school and had developed a passion for creating things with her hands, spending hours at her small workbench crafting gifts for friends and teachers. The workshop that had once been a symbol of secrets and separation had become the heart of our family's creative life. Mike and Sophie worked on projects together most weekends, their collaboration producing everything from birdhouses for our garden to custom furniture for Sophie's dollhouse. I'd started joining them occasionally, learning basic woodworking skills and finding unexpected satisfaction in the focused attention required for detailed handwork. One evening, as I watched Mike help Sophie sand the edges of a wooden jewelry box she was making for my birthday, I realized that our family's story wasn't ultimately about the trauma of separation or even the joy of reunion. It was about the resilience of love under impossible circumstances, the strength that emerges from surviving what seems unsurvivable, and the grace required to rebuild what has been broken into something even stronger than what existed before. Mike caught my eye over Sophie's bent head and smiled, the expression holding all the love and gratitude and determination that had sustained him through 4 years of exile, and continued to fuel his commitment to our family's future. Sophie looked up from her work to include me in their conversation about wood grain patterns, her green eyes bright with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved and protected by both her parents. Standing in that workshop, surrounded by the evidence of Mike's secret devotion and Sophie's growing creativity, I understood that some stories don't have simple endings, where everything returns to exactly the way it was before. Sometimes the best possible outcome is transformation, where the people who emerge from crisis are stronger, wiser, and more deeply committed to each other than they were before their world fell apart. Our family had been broken by circumstances beyond our control, but we'd chosen to rebuild it with intention, patience, and an understanding that love sometimes requires the kind of sacrifice that looks like abandonment from the outside, but is actually the deepest form of protection. Mike's disappearance had taught us all that safety and love could coexist in ways we'd never imagined, and his return had shown us that healing was possible, even when it seemed like too much damage had been done. As we turned off the workshop lights and headed back to our house for dinner, Sophie's hand in mine and Mike's arm around my shoulders, I felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who'd survived the worst thing she could imagine, and discovered that she was capable of rebuilding her life into something even more meaningful than what she'd lost. Our story had become one of endurance, sacrifice, and the quiet daily choices that constitute real love, and I was grateful for every difficult step that had brought us to this moment of peace and possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.